So that's why I'll be repeating everything back into the mic. We have the handouts in person. If anybody needs one, just flag me down and we can get you one. And we also have the handouts online. If you ever miss a week, that's so fine. There's no attendance here. At least I've not been taking it. And we have all the handouts online. So if you need the link to that, they're on the church website. But if you need a link to that, I'll give you my email address and I can get it to you throughout the week. The book still, it's not too late to start reading along if you haven't yet. The book's obviously available on Amazon with everything else. You can get it through the church office. I'm sure there are libraries around that have it. Next week, we are going to cover chapters 8 and 9. And once again, I have neglected to take off this Ransom chapter announcement, so sorry for that. Okay, we're going to start with some takeaways from last week in case you weren't here. We'll do a quick review, like a bird's eye view of what we covered last time. And then we're going to look at chapter 6, the motif of blood sacrifice. And then we'll look at chapter 7, the motif of ransom and redemption. And then we'll review and do some takeaways, and we'll have some discussion at the end before we pause to take some prayer requests. And there's no expectation that everybody in the room has read all of this stuff, so I'm trying to strike a balance as we go between giving you some helpful overview and open it up for conversation and feedback. I cannot stress enough how not bothered I will be if something's not clear. Just let me know. If you got questions or comments or thoughts along the way, please jump in so that it's less than just me throwing information at you. Does that sound good to everybody? Questions or concerns on the front end? Okay, let's do it then. So, well, let's start with the last week's takeaways. We got a little more clarification on the idea of sin last week. Fleming Rutledge, I think, is doing some interesting stuff with what sin is. It's a little bit more complex. It's a lot more complex than just the idea of your individual misactions or the bad stuff you do. That's certainly a part of it. But Rutledge says that sin is a singular, semi-autonomous power that is only ever overcome by God's radical power. It's a semi-autonomous power, singular in nature. It's almost like an energy field out there in the sky that you link up to whenever you sin. You channel that power through yourself in a way that over time you become enslaved to it. You can't get away from it. This is the sin condition, she thinks. But it is something outside of you that you're participating in. It's a corporate phenomenon, meaning that when I am sinning, I'm participating in the same semi-autonomous power that you are whenever you sin. And she thinks it's really important to say that we are both complicit, like you're responsible because you're consenting to it, and you're also captive to it. You signed up for this, and you can't get out of it. So we are captive and complicit, and this is what she means. This is what she thinks the New Testament means when she says that Jesus died for sin. It's less about just the individual bad stuff you've done. That's certainly part of it. But when Jesus dies for sin, Jesus is dying for both the semi-autonomous power and the way that you have consented to it and instantiated it and become captive to it. All of that. Then, let's see, that would have been chapter 4, I believe. Then she has a little introduction in part 2 to the idea of a motif. Because the rest of the book is just about motifs, the various motifs of the crucifixion. The motif is basically like one thread or section of a larger tapestry. And she thinks that in order to get a properly detailed, compelling vision of the crucifixion, we've got to look at the whole tapestry. We have to see the way that there's like these 10-ish or 12-ish, I forget how many, motifs all woven together. So after that, each chapter is going to focus on one thread and we'll get as much detail on that motif or thread as we can. And we're going to try and assemble the tapestry for the rest of the book and say, like, all of this together is what the crucifixion means. Okay? The first motif that she looked at is the Passover and the Exodus. And the Passover and Exodus matters because it's like the original story of deliverance from bondage that we're given in Scripture. The Hebrews are enslaved and oppressed in Egypt. It is not pleasant times. God has chosen these people and given God's self to them. They cry in distress and pain and suffering, and God hears them. God intervenes and delivers them from this situation of bondage, quite literal slavery. And she thinks that the crucifixion is basically a parallel narrative. It is a similar story of deliverance from bondage. In this case, it's not just the Hebrews, it's not just the Israelites anymore. It's universal humanity, the world, the cosmos, she thinks. And it's not just deliverance from bondage in Egypt, it's now deliverance from our captivity to sin. So it's a parallel narrative. One builds on the other one. One, she says, is more like cosmically expansive. And in a way that Fleming Rutledge is quite good at, she draws on all kinds of New Testament passages to talk about Jesus' sacrifice as a new Passover. It's a new Passover through which we're rescued from death and delivered from slavery. And then the last thing that we covered last week is this idea of the apocalyptic, which is going to become more and more important to Rutledge's motifs. So in the last maybe 20 years or so of biblical studies and theology, apocalyptic is like a whole new, it's kind of like a new framework or lens that people are rediscovering. And basically, the more that we're learning about ancient Jewish culture and practices, the more we're able to read Scripture in light of this genre that was really popular at the time. And that's helping us understand, these biblical scholars are saying, that's helping us understand the kind of like thought world and culture that Paul was moving around in. So Rutledge, along with various other people, N.T. Wright's a big one of these scholars, a lot of these folks are saying that Paul is making a lot of use of this concept or lens, framework of apocalyptic. It's a little bit different than what we're used to. So I want to review, make sure we're all clear on what she's talking about when she uses the word apocalyptic. It is basically, in its simplest, God's confrontation with the cosmic forces of death and sin. So the apocalyptic is referring to God delivering from bondage and doing so in a way that is external to the situation. Right? Which example to go to? When you are in a situation where you're so stuck, when you are in serious bondage in a way where there's no way you can deliver yourself, you are in need of an external factor, something from outside the situation as to enter into it, so as to make possible something new, to change the factors, right, to release you. This is a pretty common theme in the Hebrew scriptures, whether the Jews are in slavery, whether they're scattered in foreign lands in hope of deliverance, in the diaspora. There is a hope that, like, we're stuck here, we're anticipating God doing something new, but we can't pull this off for ourselves. So they're thinking with and writing in the terms of apocalyptic, of how is God going to break in from the outside to change up our situation. Fleming Rutledge thinks that Paul is doing the same thing with the crucifixion, that it is God entering the world from the outside so as to deliver us and create some new possibilities, because we can't pull that off for ourselves. Does that make some sense? Any questions about that or the other takeaways? Okay. I do think that the apocalyptic idea is one that she's just going to keep circling around for a while, and then it'll get a little more clear as we go. So if you're like, what is happening here? Hang in there and give it some time. All right, so let's look at chapter 6 then. I'm at the bottom of the first page here with the blood sacrifice. The blood sacrifice is the second motif that Rutledge turns to. And she's really trying to argue for, like, she's really trying to protect the idea of the church's blood imagery. You might have some theological or cultural squeamishness around some of that blood imagery, but she's going to make a pretty compelling case of why it's so important and crucial for us. She says it's all throughout the church tradition, it's all throughout the New Testament. Let's try and figure out why rather than just steer clear of it. So on page 233, she writes that the motif of sacrifice, and especially blood sacrifice, is central to the story of our salvation through Jesus Christ. And without that theme, sacrifice and blood sacrifice, without that, the Christian proclamation loses much of its power. It becomes both theologically and ethically undernourished. So to remove the blood imagery, particularly the concept of blood sacrifice, then she says you're kind of weakening the message. It's going to be hard to like tease out the full ethical significance. And it's going to be hard to tease out the full salvific significance as well. For reasons that we'll get to in just a moment, I want you to know that the concept of sacrifice has been under fire for a while in theological circles. So Rutledge is going to give us some of the context to say, here's what the concerns are from theologians about sacrifice, and here's why she thinks we need to keep it nonetheless. So for the last 40 years, especially feminist theologians or theologians of color, various minority groups are saying sacrifice, not the most helpful thing for us to talk about because of the way that it plays out culturally. Rutledge wants to take seriously that criticism, but also say, here's how and why we need to use it in a way that addresses those criticisms, but also still makes sense of what's given to us in the scriptural passages. So she thinks, theologians love definitions. So she thinks there's two parts to a legitimate definition of sacrifice. The first one is that something of value has to be relinquished. Something of value has to be given away. If I do not care at all about this cup of tea, it's not very sacrificial if I end up giving it to you. I don't care anything about it, right? You can have it. It costs me nothing. I'm legitimately giving it to you, but it comes at no cost. Rutledge thinks it's therefore not a sacrifice. It's just giving something away. The second part is that the purpose is to gain a greater good. So in order for an act to count as a sacrifice, something of value has to be given away for the sake of gaining something of greater good. Something of value has to be given away. Something of greater value has to be earned back. She says this matters on the top of page 2. She says this matters because Jesus positions himself as an efficacious sacrifice for the whole human race and for the cosmos for all time. The whole human race, she thinks. And like the world creation as it is for all time, once and for all. When she looks at the sin offerings in Leviticus, she thinks that we can learn, this is a quote from her, she says, we can learn that God himself has provided the means for the continual restoration of the people in view of their sinfulness. The continual restoration. This has some of that apocalyptic ring to it, right? The people are in bondage, there's a problem. Jesus from the outside is going to provide the means through which restoration can happen. And it turns out that Jesus is both providing the means and is the means. God's the one who's like making the way, and the way is Jesus himself, crucifixion. Let's see. She says that it is God who ordained the way in which justice and mercy would be enacted. And the hilasmos, I think that's how you say that word, but folks who have been to seminary can correct me. It's in reference to the expiation or propitiation for the sins of the whole world. Right? God makes a way and becomes the way, is what I really think the important takeaway is here. It's not that God sends somebody else in or sends a fix that doesn't implicate God in the struggle. God makes a way and becomes the way for your release from bondage. And because sacrifice can take both a verbal and a noun form, I can sacrifice something, or something can be a sacrifice. It can be an action or an entity. Rutledge says that it's helpful for us to acknowledge that Jesus doesn't merely offer a sacrifice, but Jesus becomes a sacrifice, as is indicated in the high priestly prayer of John 17. Jesus makes a way and becomes a way. There's a sacrifice given. Something is sacrificed, which is Jesus, and he is the sacrifice in both the verbal and the noun form. So this little section, she's really just saying, God makes the way, God becomes the way in Jesus. And now she'll give us some of these criticisms. So there's a really helpful quote here I want to read. It's most of a paragraph. But this will help. This is like a spot-on summary of one of the big trends in Christian theology for the last 30 or 40 years, where specifically a bunch of feminist theologians are saying the concept of sacrifice plays out in kind of a patriarchal way. Like it's easy for us to talk about sacrifice in a way that really puts the burden on women or people of color to just like settle in for the long run. And theologians have been saying, that's not what's going on in the New Testament necessarily, but when we talk about it in these sacrificial terms, it kind of flattens out a lot of our own social and political discourse. So she's going to take up the recent feminist and womanist criticisms regarding redemptive suffering, particularly as it pertains to the crucifixion. So I'm in the middle of page 2, and I do think this is a really helpful overview of the problem. She says, quote, there is presently an intense reaction rooted in women's experience against the whole concept of sacrifice. And this is one of the most important challenges to the theology of sacrifice. And in some quarters, it is now being taken with great seriousness. It's argued that women have traditionally been the ones to assume a disproportionate amount of sacrificing. Women have to do more of the sacrificing, she says. Historically, that's, she thinks, just like an obvious case. Many women have been conditioned to think that they have no choices except to be ignored, patronized, and exploited and abused. And this has been disabling for women, profoundly so in many cases, and it's part of the work of the church in our time to rethink the whole matter. So she's saying that historically, women have to do the sacrificing, and when they're ignored or patronized or exploited or abused, the idea of redemptive suffering or sacrifice is kind of like a churchy term that we use to cover over those injustices. That's what the theologians have been concerned about. And they're saying, well, this is not what the crucifixion or sacrifice is supposed to be about, but this is how it plays out. So let's fix the shortcomings here. And particularly for feminist and womanist theologians in the last 40 years, they're saying there are other ways to talk about the crucifixion that don't have to have these negative consequences. So let's pause on sacrifice for a while, come up with some new terms so we can do some different kind of social work. Rutledge is going to say the criticisms are right, but let me build a case of how and why we need to keep sacrifice and how and why it can actually address those kinds of like patriarchal issues. So she thinks that the criticism is largely like a reductionistic aesthetic response, that the issue actually isn't about sacrifice as much as our poor understanding of sacrifice. If that makes sense. I'm all ears to hear if you find this compelling or not. I'm on the fence about it, but it's important to at least understand what Rutledge is saying, I think. So she thinks that a more proper understanding of sacrifice makes the issue go away. It can resolve the problem and fix it. Not just like get us out of the bind. But she thinks we can have the cake of the concept of sacrifice, and we can eat it too, where we don't have to just let it negatively impact women. And to be fair, she does suggest that whatever a sacrificial trope is negatively used for the sake of repression, it should be both resisted and condemned. So she's like all in for the criticisms that these theologians are giving. And whenever a sacrifice is leading towards repression, it's a bad idea of sacrifice and it needs to be resisted. But she doesn't want to toss it out. She wants to rethink it in terms of power so as to more properly avoid its current associations with weakness and abjection. She doesn't like that we just simply correlate the idea of sacrifice with weakness, or like lowly social positions. Power, she says, comes in two forms. And she explains that there's a good and bad, and that the sacrificial life that's modeled in Jesus trades in an alternative kind of power rather than self-abjection. So the vision of power that we see in Jesus kind of contests the way that we're using sacrifice to keep people in states of repression, social repression. She says that it's characteristically true of the New Testament's treatment of sacrifice, that it is this alternative vision, and she demonstrates the insight by tying sacrifice into the apocalyptic treatment of the crucifixion. So I'm just going to pause here to take a big breath because we're in the weeds. It's a lot of moving pieces, right? So big zoom out. The feminist and womanist theologians are tired of talking about sacrifice because it has bad social effects. Fleming Rutledge says they're onto something, and it does play out this way, but it's also all scattered throughout the New Testament, and they're doing something in the New Testament that's different than how we're using it in our own context. She says it's got this apocalyptic flair to it in the New Testament in a way that gives us a more compelling vision of what sacrifice is. So we can keep it and we can use it to resist the kind of bad social implications. That's all that's going on. I say that's all that's going on. It's a pretty complex set of things. She writes on page 274 that Paul understood the crucifixion as the definitive apocalyptic engagement with the forces of the enemy at the frontier of the ages, where Jesus' self-abandonment was the ultimate weapon, the ultimate form of passive resistance that overwhelms and routs the enemy. It's a very different kind of sacrifice, she thinks, than the one that's supposed to just keep struggling people in their struggling situation. This is the kind of power, she thinks, that is really aimed at liberation, flourishing. Very different than how the concept of sacrifice has historically been used, she thinks. And that leads to, I'm at the top of page 3, this will wrap up our stuff on sacrifice. She says this leads to a direct address of the old world form of legalism and repression that feminists are rightly worried about. So she's redone the idea of sacrifice. She thinks Paul's got a pretty flourishing, liberative, alternative kind of power image of sacrifice. And that's going to help us actually resist the kinds of legalism and suffering that the feminists are rightly concerned about. And Rutledge would count herself amongst that group. She just wants to say, let's not toss sacrifice out. Let's keep it. Let's just do a better job of understanding what it is. Because what Scripture is giving us is actually richer than what we're using. All right, so this is probably the most complex thing we've done so far. What's not clear? What questions do you have? Yes, would you tell me your name?
Suzanne.
Suzanne.
If you go back to the two elements of sacrifice that you have on the bottom of page 1 and the top of page 2.
Yeah.
Where the purpose is to gain a greater good and giving up something of value. And you think about the repression, whether it's the women or the nuns or what have you. When they're repressed, I have not seen any evidence that it falls into that either one of those criteria. There's no greater good and there's nothing that's being given up of value.
Great, I think that's exactly right. So Suzanne, right?
Yes.
Suzanne's saying for my Zoom folks, that the stuff, the social situations that feminists and womanists are rightly concerned about, where women and minorities are kept in suffering places, doesn't actually fit the definition of sacrifice that Rutledge has given. They might have to give something up of like their time, their bodies, their desires, whatever it would be, but they're not getting anything greater in return, right? If I want to go write a book and I'm telling my wife, you need to stay home with the kids, and this is what sacrifice is all about, she's giving up her time and desires and opportunities. She's not gaining anything greater for it. The book for me is surely not going to do that, right? So it doesn't really fit the classic concept of sacrifice. So the repression of women's experience and minorities, there's something being given, there's not something greater being gained, it's therefore not a sacrifice. And that's precisely why she thinks the definition is so important, and the New Testament vision can help us do the work to figure out whether something is legitimate or illegitimate. Because it has to fit this vision of sacrifice in order for us to be able to say that this social situation checks out. That's helpful. Yes. Would you remind me of your name?
Mary Beth.
Mary Beth.
So, or if we think about what women and minorities have been through as sacrifice, we can make a distinction. They were forced to sacrifice, and Jesus chose to sacrifice.
I think that's right. Yeah, Mary Beth is saying that there's also a distinction about your will in the moment of maybe sacrifice has to be your consent to the exchange versus minorities and women's experiences where you're not consenting to this thing. It's the only option available to you, forced to it.
And the definition of the greater good comes from the oppressor in the first case.
Yes, the definition of the greater good comes from the oppressor in the first case. I think that's really helpful. Yeah. I'm curious, do you find this compelling? Like, do you think that the idea of sacrifice works? Does it make sense to you? Does it address the criticisms? I'm getting a nod. Can you tell us about what you're thinking? Sorry, in the green shirt, you're gonna have to remind me your name.
Shannon.
Shannon.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like the larger picture and the social picture that we did.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so we separate that social picture. We have to understand that social picture is not anywhere near the cost of Jesus giving his life for us as a sacrifice.
Okay, that's helpful. So Shannon's saying we're going to separate out our own social experiences and world from the sacrifice of Jesus so as to see their differences. And what I think you're implying too is you can connect those things in different ways, right? The bad read of sacrifice that leads to bad social experiences.
Right.
And a good read of sacrifice that Rutledge thinks can lead to positive social experiences. And you find that compelling.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
I didn't find the chapter.
Say more about that. She did not find the chapter.
It was, I just kept getting lost in the weeds. It was just
Totally.
too much information for me.
I get that.
You know, the one on ransom and redemption, that was fine.
Okay.
But
Well,
I
there's
just
hope
thought
for us
that,
yet.
I just thought that was, it was just, I was just bombarded with ideas that I had a hard time filtering.
Yeah, Shannon is noting just the intensity and whirlwind of information that the chapter was, which
I'm not
I think
gonna
is.
be a preacher.
No, but you're a sharp reader who teaches theology courses, so I think it's a poignant criticism that there's a lot of stuff going on in here. It's easy to get lost in the weeds. Good, and I think that's important to name too. Yes.
Bill, does
Bill.
Rutledge address the condition that a lot of times the greater good that comes from a sacrifice is much later than the event, and in fact, even later than a death and that it still has the same meaning, even though it's not realized by the individual or group.
That's a great question. Bill's asking if she ever looks at the temporal dimension, that the sacrifice, the payoff or the return from a sacrifice doesn't have to be immediate, there could be a delay. I don't know that she talks explicitly about that, but I think she would say definitely, because historically speaking, Rutledge wants to say we're kind of in the in-between time between the sacrifice of Jesus and the full payoff. Sin has been defeated in the crucifixion and the resurrection, and yet I still sin, right? I'm still able to participate in this thing, so it's not fully abolished yet. And then I think that gives us, historically speaking, a pretty big gap between the moment it's done, the sacrifice and the full payoff or return. Yeah, but I don't know that she dives into it too much, so that'd be interesting. Okay, let's do ransom and redemption. And I think Shannon is right, this one's a little easier. Nice breath of fresh air. Though I do so love the experience of being in a chapter where there's a bunch of ideas and you just like wrestling with it, trying to figure out what is actually going on. I love that so much. All right. In Ransom and Redemption, Rutledge is most interested in examining the concept of redemption by way of ransom. And she's particularly concerned with the question of whether or not these ideas refer to some price paid or a general deliverance. This is also downstream from conversations in theology of where people are asking, how are we supposed to understand what's going on in the crucifixion? Is Jesus a kind of price that God pays to free you from your sins? Is Jesus's death just, what's the second? Oh yeah, general deliverance. Is Jesus's death not so much like the price that you owe as much as God's way of delivering you? So at times theologians will use the idea of ransom. God pays the ransom to set you free. The ransom just has to be his son. There's some, in terms of linking the two tiers that Shannon's talking about, of like the cosmic God stuff and our social world, you can link those poorly with the idea of ransom. God's going to give his kid away in order to make everything fine. What does this say about the way that God relates to God's kid and how I should relate to my kid in light of this? These are real criticisms that people have made, not because of what Jesus is actually doing in the resurrection, as much as the language we're using to talk about it, right? It's the language that we're using to talk about it and how that informs our lives. She's going to try and figure out, what do we do with ransom and what do we do with redemption? What does that have to do with the price paid? Is there any price? What does it mean that we would talk about the crucifixion in terms of price? And how does that relate to redemption? And she's going to basically take all of it and like put it in the blender and hold it all together. So after she first does a long litany of all the places that ransom language shows up in the early theologians in the Middle Ages. And she will end up going with a big Episcopal thinker, Austin Farrar's interpretation of the parable nature of the ransom metaphor. So it's her talking about one particular read, one very Episcopal Church of England read of what ransom means, and she's thinking about this in terms of a parable. In the end, she's going to urge us to understand redemption as both a model of general deliverance and, more particularly, deliverance at a cost. Redemption for Fleming Rutledge is deliverance at a cost. So to remove the idea of cost, she thinks would deprive us of one of the core of the gospel's narrative, which is that God is actively and intimately involved in our deliverance. This is not like the idea of abstraction here is important. It's not like this passe divine being who just with the like snap of a finger, the wave of a hand, makes our problem go away. Right? You can almost think of like a self-absorbed emperor who, like, there's one peasant who shows up and like all you have to do is like wave your hand and everything in my life changes forever. But like, is it even worth the emperor's time? Fleming Rutledge is saying we want to resist that idea of God's engagement with us. God is very intimately involved in our deliverance from sin. It comes at a significant cost to God. So the cost is less about always reminding you of the debt you owe. The cost is about reminding you of the way that God is so intimately involved. This is not like an easy thing that God goes through in order to release you from sin. The crucifixion we talked about from the beginning is like a very systematic form of torture and death. It's like the lynching in the electric chair. It's all kinds of messaging. There's all kinds of suffering. It comes at a great cost, not because of your debt or terribleness, though you do have those things, but because like that's the depth to which God is going to go to set you free, to make things right. And don't give up on the idea of cost, because when you give up on the idea of cost, you get this emperor who waves a hand at a distance and without any involvement makes a problem go away. She says, and that this is probably settling in now, how so much of this is just about the language that we're using. It really is us trying to come up with how do we narrate or talk about what happens in the crucifixion? What do we think it means? What is the meaning of the language that we use? Because there's implications to all of it. And especially to go back, I really like Shannon's metaphor, so I'm not going to let that go for a while. When we're talking about how we link up this cosmic stuff with our own social situation, you're going to tie them together at some point. And the way you tie them together is going to be downstream from how you're talking about what this means. And there's bad ways to tie them together, and there's good ways to tie them together. So we're going to try and get as clear as we can on the language to understand it, but also to have the best kind of mirror of it that we can. She says, it seems that we can imagine all kinds of engagement and relational encounter that doesn't involve exchange. But Rutledge is too worried she worries that God is too removed and passe if there's no cost to God here. If there's no cost, then it's hard to talk about a real intimate relational exchange with God and humanity. And the imagery that we've been given is that of God giving God's self as a ransom, precisely because it comes at a cost. There's the famous canonic passage of Philippians, I believe, Philippians 1. Is that right? Where Christ gives up all the things of the heaven to subject himself to the lowly death. There's like very much an emptying or a giving up or a taking off of the heavenly righteousness that's fitting for the second person of the Trinity. This is a cost, right? And enters to the lowly form of a peasant. The dude is born like in a farmhouse. There's like feces and animals around. It comes at an intense cost, not because of your debt, but because of the intimacy, the depths that God goes to make this thing available to you. She also thinks that this vision sidesteps the popular divine child abuse criticisms by noting that all three members of the Trinity undertake the cross together. And that is similarly in the last 30 or 40 years, probably not as frequent of a criticism of how we talk about the resurrection, but it's a pretty common checkpoint for people to say, the way you're narrating the crucifixion just sounds like God is abusing God's kid. That can't be it. It can't be good. It's a bad way. It's going to have bad implications for us socially, but it's also just like an obvious checkpoint that we're misunderstanding what's happening in the crucifixion. God's not like out to hurt or to get Jesus for the sake of something else. We got to have a different set of language and metaphors to make sense of it. And she thinks this vision of deliverance at a cost is very much, there's no like abuse overtones to it, which is good. That's what we want. She's going to insist that we can't phrase this ransom as a new change of plan that caught God off guard. It's not like God found God's self in the middle of the narrative. It was like, oh shoot, here we are. How am I going to get out of this bind? It's going to cost me something. God's response follows the same pattern of self-giving love that is essential and pretemporal, which means there's no new thing. All this means is that Rutledge is saying, one, this doesn't catch God off guard, and two, this is not a new kind of action. It's not that God finds God's self in the middle of history and is like, well, I'm going to have to change some stuff, act in a new way, do something new to fix the situation. Rutledge is really just trying to say, we can have a unique historical act and God can be unchanging. This is the same pattern that God follows eternity for eternity. So it's helpful for me to think about this as if we think of the three persons of the Trinity and they're in this like stellar relationship and love is just constantly circulating through all of them. We can almost imagine this as a kind of a pattern or a movement of love and goodness that is unchanging for all time. And Rutledge is going to say that same pattern continues up until like the depths of our sin, and the pattern is just applied to the world without God changing. And what we get when we apply that pattern to the world is the crucifixion, deliverance at a cost. There's no new thing for God here. It's like perfectly fitting. It's perfectly fitting because of who God eternally is, that God takes care of us in the crucifixion in this way, through self-giving love. She's just trying to say, this is who God has always been. And it's no surprise to God that the crucifixion has to happen. And in the end, this is on page 302, in the end, she's going to argue that the redemption, this is a quote, the redemption wrought by God in Christ was indeed a mighty deliverance and points ahead to the glorious future of the reign of God. The ransom imagery reminds us that this great liberation involved not only a loosing from bondage, but also an atonement for sin. Not only a cosmic victory, but also an ultimate price. You can see here how she's already weaving these motifs together. Deliverance from bondage, check. Liberation, check. Atonement for your sin and semi-autonomous sin, check. The cosmic victory, check. And an ultimate price, again, for the sake of proximity and cost. The cost of our redemption was the crucifixion of the Son of God. Otherwise, we cannot find a place within our understanding for the sheer horror and godlessness of such a death. Quote. All right, that's Ransom and Redemption. Let's do some quick takeaways, and then we'll have about 5 or 6 minutes for questions and discussions. So first, takeaway is that Jesus positions himself as an efficacious sacrifice for the whole of the human race and for the cosmos. And that she's going to say it's got to be both of those. It's got to be like bigger than you in order to address the size and scale and semi-autonomous power of sin. But it also has to be you. You are stuck in a way that you can't like get out of your captivity to it. And you did consent to it. So it's got to be both of those. She says, 2, it's God who ordained the way in which justice and mercy would be enacted. And for the sins of the world, God makes a way and God becomes that way. She says that whenever a sacrificial trope is negatively used, like sacrifice limited women's experience, she says whenever that happens for the sake of repression, it should be both resisted and condemned. And yet, let's not actually toss out the vision of sacrifice in the New Testament. Let's dive in, get the more rich understanding of the sacrifice in the New Testament, and then use that to criticize the bad forms of it that lead to repression. She's most interested in examining the concept of redemption by way of ransom. Redemption is deliverance at a great cost. We don't want the unenthused emperor who can't be bothered with the peasants. We want the God who throws off the riches of heaven and eternality and eternal praise. It's totally fitting to come into the world and to suffer for the sake of proximity, just to be close to you, just to understand the fullness of your experience. That's why it matters for us to talk about the cost of God, or what this costs God. And she's going to argue that law court imagery is indeed much less prioritized and common in the New Testament than apocalyptic imagery. I actually think that's a sneak peek of where we go next week, so I'm going to wait on the law court imagery. That was a mistake. That was a cut and paste error on my part. Okay, so let's do it this way. I want to leave time for prayer requests. Let's just open it up to what's helpful here. What's helpful? Mary Beth,
Yes.
is that right?
The
Mary Beth.
biggest takeaway for me is what you said toward the end. I mean, part of that is just because you said it toward the end. But it answers a really big question for me, or something that I often struggle with, is how can God be not changing?
Yeah.
And this explanation of being unchanging in the midst of history is very helpful to me.
Good.
So that was very helpful. And I actually started to think about, and I might have a takeaway at some point, of how that plays out in the Old Testament.
Yeah, that would be
So,
interesting.
Yeah.
So Mary Beth is saying the most helpful takeaway so far is the way that she's holding the tension between an unchanging God and a God involved in history. And that you get both of those, even if it's not exactly clear how they play out. What else? Yes.
Ed,
Ed.
does there have to be a resurrection in order for the crucifixion to really be a sacrifice?
Yes. Brother says yes.
Explain that to me, Lucy.
Happy to. Ed asked, does there have to be a resurrection in order for the crucifixion to count as a sacrifice? I think the return that she talks about, of that second aspect of the definition, depends on, I'll phrase it this way. Jesus has to beat the power of sin and death. It can't overcome Jesus. I do think it is as that simple. If Jesus doesn't come back from the dead, then sin's still around, and it was big enough that it kind of wiped out one of the members of the Godhead. When we get resurrection, it's like the victory march, basically, the final period to say that God overcame this thing and like consumed it rather than was consumed by it. So I don't. Shannon, did I see your hand?
Yeah, I was just gonna say that I think reading all of this, that it sort of enlarges my understanding of what the Trinity is. Because I have friends that they really worship Jesus. They don't worship God.
Yeah.
And when I say things about God the Creator, they look at me really funny. I know. Have you been saved?
Yeah.
And so I, it to me, if it's all together,
Good. Shannon's saying the big takeaway is that it is important for Rutledge that this is a Trinitarian, the crucifixion is a Trinitarian affair. It is not an action that is just in the second person of Jesus. All three persons of the Godhead are very much involved in it. She's quite clear about that. Good. One more, is there one more takeaway? Yeah. Will you remind me of your name? Dulcie.
Do you think that Rutledge would consider that we should be, that actually we should have been, because of our sin, we should have been the one who was crucified instead of Jesus?
I think she wants to resist that. I think she wants to say you are on the hook, you're responsible for your sins. But I think she wants to push against just thinking of the idea of God was in your place, for the sake of saying that God is addressing much more in the crucifixion than just my limited sins. So if the way I narrate the crucifixion is Jesus took Zach Settle's place, then the success of the crucifixion is Jesus addressed Zach Settle's sins. But what does that mean for all of yours? What does that mean for the semi-autonomous power? So she's going to say it's actually a much richer thing than Jesus just taking your place, because your place is addressed in addition to all of the other stuff that Jesus is fixing. Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay, let's pause here Any prayer requests before we pray and part ways? Shannon.
My friend Anna Fowler has been on hospice care for a while, and that's not my sister Hannah, that's her sister-in-law. And, she is transitioning, so if y'all would keep her in your prayer.
Yeah.
She's an awesome lady. She's been really sick for a long time.
Okay. Definitely. What else? Okay, I'll pray for us. God, we pause and say thanks. Thank you for the gift of today and the way that you continue to hold all of this up in existence in your hands and give us the good gift of being and being together. Thank you for the opportunity to be here in this time and place and orient ourselves together to the stories you've given us, the sacrifices that you've given us, the good gifts of baptism and Eucharist and sitting together. And we ask that you would be with us today, or at least give us the grace to see the ways that you're already present to us. We ask for a special measure of grace and peace for Anna Fowler and the folks caring for her in hospice, that there would be peace and a lack of pain and presence and grace in the midst of this transition. We ask for your presence and care and address to any other pressing concerns that have been unnamed. And we ask that you would continue to work on each of us. You would draw us to yourself in all things and have mercy on us in them as well. In Christ's name, amen. All right, we will be back here next week.